I think it's fine in trying out a leadership role and then going, do you know what, this isn't for me. I really get my buzz from making stuff. And I think it's admirable that they then say, do you know what, this isn't for me? Because the worst thing is to watch someone go through that and carry on because they feel like they have to, and they're just burning out in that role because it just doesn't fulfill them.
If you want to build a career as a designer, the path usually seems to go only one way, and that's up. You start as a junior, move to senior, perhaps become a design lead, a manager, a director, and maybe even reach VP status. But what if you don't want to follow that ladder? What options are left for designers who want to stay close to the craft, or who simply aren't drawn to leadership roles? That's what we're going to explore today with Andy Polaine, one of the most respected design leadership coaches in the industry, author of Service Design From Insight to Implementation, and the prolific host of the podcast The Power of 10. Andy Polaine, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. For all of those who are feeling imposter syndrome, whenever I hear someone read my bio like that, I feel it immediately. So that's very kind of you.
Well, let's start with the first question. So, society tends to place a higher premium on leadership than on craft. This is evident in the higher compensation leaders receive compared to craftspeople, abundance of leadership courses, and the recognition and influence associated with leadership roles. How do you see this emphasis on leadership playing out in the design industry or in organizations where design plays a role?
That's such a huge question. I'd probably unpack it a little bit, I think. One is probably to make a distinction between leadership and management. And obviously there's an overlap there on the Venn diagram. Organizationally, becoming a people manager means you're responsible. You have the reports, right? So you're responsible for people in some way or another. You're either responsible for the kind of one-on-ones and their kind of career progression. You may be responsible. You may be the person they have to ask to go on vacation and stuff like that, or you're involved in promotion discussions. Leadership doesn't necessarily have to involve that, right? So if you are in a principal or sometimes staff, but that's a bit of an American thing more than it is in Europe, designer role, where you're not actually sort of, from an HR perspective, managing people, you can still be leading your craft in some way. So that's sort of that bit. I think leadership is kind of hugely fetishized on LinkedIn at least. And I say this as someone who coaches design leaders, and my just so people know, my range of people goes from sometimes senior, but it's mostly leads upwards, right? I think I've probably had one or two CDOs, but they're very rare anyway. Certainly like VPs of design and things like that. And there's a built-in bias, right? Because obviously the people who are at the top of the tree, who are most involved in deciding who gets paid what, pay themselves very well. So that's one thing. There's I would argue there's an industrial class structure there that comes from the UK. Mm-hmm. If you think that sort of organizational culture and sort of structures mirror generally the technology of the day, the switch into the Industrial Revolution sort of 150, 60, 70 years ago was basically this factory model where you had, the whole idea of the assembly line was that, unskilled, apparently in quotes, I'm doing air quotes, labor could do rote tasks, so do repeated things over and over again. And what you did was you broke down something complex or complicated into small discrete tasks so that those people could do those. You didn't need to, you could learn how to, press rivets or something once and then you're fine. The class thing behind that is that the white collar people who sat in the sort of glass office overlooking the factory floor, checking to see whether those kind of work shy workers were doing their work or not. It has that whole idea in it that actually you have to supervise those people because otherwise they're going to slack off. You have to, this is the whole sort of back to work thing, return to office thing that's still sort of going on. And that those are the smart people in the glass office who then know what's going on. So it's kind of important to trace that all the way back because that's still very prevalent in the way we think about leadership quite often. I think that when you're talking about the sort of societal aspect of it, that's very much still in there, right? You see it in that whole kind of founder mode thing and the whole sort of .com bro thing going on too, which is those people who have usually been quite privileged and incredibly lucky, because you don't hear the stories about the people who didn't make it, who've been successful, see themselves as somehow kind of amazingly brilliant geniuses, and everyone else is a bit stupid. And if only they ran the world, things would be great. I mean, Elon Musk, right? So that's the context within which I think leadership's often sitting. And I don't really kind of like that very much, because I've seen the part of the problem with it is it can make for a very kind of toxic kind of, certainly narcissistic, if not sort of slightly sociopathic type of person who actually does quite well in large organizations, because they're the kind of people who they can be very charming, they can be very, they're always putting themselves out there at the cost of everyone else, and they can quite easily climb the ladder. So it's really problematic, all of that stuff. And the other problem, I think, with leadership is that when you see HBR articles that say things like, here are the 7 traits of highly successful leaders, the way they do that is they go and speak to successful leaders, which is fair enough. And having interviewed them, they sort of synthesize a set of traits that they commonly hold, also fair enough. The problem is this idea that you can kind of run the tape backwards, that if you just evidence those traits, then you'll be a highly successful leader. And that's the wrong way around. So I much prefer to think of leadership in terms of being an enabler, because that's kind of really what you're doing. It's far less this idea of like, hey, everyone, I'm brilliant, follow me, than it is someone needs to make decisions sometimes. Someone needs to kind of provide some kind of vision and direction and purpose. And you then need to enable everyone to be able to do that. And the reason why I like the word enabler is because it has this negative connotation too, right? We talk about enabling addicts and alcoholics, bullying, racism, sexism, all the rest of it, right? You can enable that by your behavior. And so that's why I much prefer to kind of think about it in that way. So it was a very long answer, but it was a big question, I think.
When I read your post, whether it is on a website or on LinkedIn, I sense a deep respect for the skill, mastery and satisfaction that comes from the craft of design. But what about design environments where okay is considered good enough? Business goals takes precedence over solving user challenges, or much of the work is already defined by templates. In those situations, what is the value of a craftsperson?
I think it's much more healthy if designers tend to think in terms of how can design serve the business. Right? And yes, of course, we take that idea that we are the voice of the customer, voice of the end user, and all of that sort of stuff. But I think if you have that perspective of how does that then serve the business, one of my favorite coaching questions is kind of so what, right? So why do we need to go and do more research into users, and so what? And you go, well, because we want to know what they really need, so what? And eventually you ladder up to this thing where it's kind of 3 things, actually. You ladder up to something that the stakeholders care about, and it's usually, saving money, making money, and avoiding risk. And avoiding risk is really just saving money, time shifted. So with that perspective, it's much less of adversarial. And then part of it is then thinking around, what can design do in the context that we're in? And to the question around sort of templated culture and stuff, I think it's a shame to have seen design. So part of me, the sort of craftsperson part of me, feels it's a shame to see design having been made a real effort to be more strategic, because there's great power in that. It really is for businesses in terms of serving the business. There's a lot that design can bring to that sort of strategic level of, what should we be creating and why should we be doing this and so forth, right? We're really good at answering those questions, particularly at the front end where it's fairly fuzzy and the people don't really know what is this thing we're trying to do. We've got a hunch about it. And designers are really good at that bit. But I do think that there's a thing that's happened, and I generally sort of lay the blame at product here, but it's partly the sort of productization thing that's happened, and it goes back to that industrial thing that it allowed companies to sort of slip back into a sort of command and control structure where one person was whether it's the CPO or the kind of product manager or head of product, sort of essentially decides this is what we're going to be doing. They're the kind of mini Steve Jobs. And, they've talked about this idea of being the sort of mini CEO. And then it's pushed everyone else down into the kind of feature factory. But then I'm talking about sort of suboptimal product environments here,
Sure.
feature factories. And so designers then just become those kind of assembly line workers again. And then it's been going on long enough. There's a whole generation of designers who have come up who really, a lot of their experience has been pushing around someone else's design system,
Sure.
templates and parts, and not actually kind of doing the sort of more crunchy working it out work. So that is a problem. That said, I'm definitely of that generation, or of a kind of generation who really felt like at some point, maybe 10 years ago, if only designers, and in my case, service designers, were running the world, everything would be amazing. And a really strong desire to create these amazing, as best as we possibly could, sort of bespoke experiences. I've come to kind of believe that's a bit of a fool's errand. And it's also kind of incredibly arrogant, right? I think I wrote a long essay. It's called On Mediocrity, and it was in my newsletter. And I realized that, quite often I will buy a T-shirt from H&M, or, I don't know, a suit from Zara or something like that. We all go for the kind of mediocre that'll do thing in some part of our lives, right? Whether it's food or clothes or furniture. I bet most people listening have got some IKEA furniture in their house. And it's exactly that, right? Which is good enough. I think that in some respects, the design project has been successful because the language of design is not nearly as foreign as it used to be, like 15 years ago even. But I think we just kind of felt like everyone wanted a sort of bespoke Savile Row suit, and we wanted to create that instead of realizing that a lot of the time, the sort of mediocre middle was good enough. It was better than those organizations had before, and they don't want to spend more money on it. And it's a kind of awful truth to kind of face. And I suspect as a more junior designer, it's a bit depressing when you come out of design school, where it feels like you've been sort of promised all these things to save the world, only to find that actually people just want you to sort of design something decent and sort of get over yourself.
The designer has decided that leadership isn't the right path. Yet those who move into leadership roles, they gain more influence and recognition. How do you advise designers to find fulfillment and impact in their careers if they choose not to pursue a leadership role?
Well, there's two bits to this, actually, I think. I think it's worth trying out. And I think it's probably worth trying more than once. My first experience of being in a leadership role, I was actually quite young. I was about... I can say, I think it was like 29 or 30 or something. And I sort of really didn't know what I was doing. And it was quite a shock. That's when I actually first discovered that, what I call the design leadership dip thing, where I felt like I was letting go of my craft skills and not very good at the sort of leadership or management skills. And so I sort of stuck somewhere in the middle. I think it's fine in trying out a leadership role and then going, do you know what, this isn't for me. I really get my buzz from making stuff. I really think that's okay. And I've seen people, I've had people I've worked with who've done that. And I think it's admirable that they then say, do you know what, this isn't for me? Because the worst thing is to watch someone go through that and carry on because they feel like they have to, and they're just burning out in that role because it just doesn't fulfill them. Conversely, I've seen other people who've maybe someone said, hey, you should sort of go for this, or we're going to promote you into this. And they weren't necessarily that ambitious about it. And then they've really thrived because they've discovered this new thing. So I really think it's worth kind of trying that out. If you decide, or either before that or after it, that you don't want to do it, with any job or any project, you need to find something that is fulfilling for you, something that energizes you, that you really like it. For some people, it can be a tiny thing, right? It can be a tiny little kind of pet project on the side. It can be... an initiative they're trying to get. It could be as small as, I set up a feedback Fridays or something, or a critique Friday, or a brown bag lunch session every month, so that we can kind of raise the quality of their work and bring, and that's the thing you do. So it could be a craft thing of trying to do this thing better and better, and better can take a lot of different forms, right? Faster, higher quality, more sort of nuance, whatever. Any of those things fulfill you. I think with work, there's generally a sort of three things. There's work that nourishes yourself, right, in some way. So that could be a hobby. There's work that nourishes your wallet, that's your sort of the main thing that gives you income. And then there's work that nourishes the world in some way. So, some of those things might overlap. If you're really lucky, you do a job that all those three things overlap. But I think we have a bit of a sort of monogamous view of what work should be, that we are trying to find the one, right? We're trying to find this idea of this job that fulfills all of these different aspects of our lives. And actually, I think we need to take a bit of more sort of polyamorous view on work, which is, there's different things in my life that are sort of work-like things that fulfill different stuff. Mm-hmm. And I know a few people who do that. I would say I do that. I've got a sort of bit of a portfolio career these days. There's different things that fulfill different aspects of my life, and certainly, I find that with coachees. And I think that's a more useful way to think about your work and your job, and to find some kind of fulfillment. Right?
You write in your post, and when you talk in your podcast, you talk about the motivations and circumstances to become a leader. What are, in your experience, the wrong reasons to become a leader? And how can people identify the real reasons to become a leader?
The biggest wrong reason is ego, right? I mean, we all have it, and there's a certain amount of ego is important, because it sort of drives you forward. It also sort of psychologically protects you in some ways too, especially when you're younger. But if it's because you want control and because you want to sort of tell everyone what to do and all that stuff, and particularly because you just want the title and kind of to feel great about yourself, it's like anything else in life. If you want something external to be sort of bestowed upon you in order to make yourself feel good about yourself, there's usually a kind of problem there, right? Because what you're not tackling is why you're not feeling good about yourself in the first place. It's sort of better the other way around, where you really like what you're doing. Other people recognize that you're good at it and would like you to take a leading role in doing that, and you thrive because you'll carry on doing more of that at a more senior level. That's one thing. I would not necessarily do it for the money if it's going to de-energize you. Right? I talk a lot about energizing and de-energizing. It is a little bit woo-woo, but what I mean by that is your body generally doesn't lie. Right? You can rationalize yourself or post-rationalize yourself into all sorts of circumstances, and think, yes, but it's a really good title, it's a really good job, it's a really great company. It's good. It's not a great company. It's got a very big name, or whoever, if you're working for one of the kind of big tech companies, and yet you hate getting up to work. For work in the morning, you hate Monday mornings, or get all depressed on Sunday evenings. At the end of the day, you're feeling depleted, or you're sort of struggling to sleep. All of those things are telling you something's not right there. And you will end up in burnout. I'm going to have plenty of coachees who are on the cusp of, or sort of have already gone into burnout. Mm. And if you stay in that for a long time because the money is important, or because you can't let go of the title, or whatever it is, you'll find that you need at least the amount of time that you've burnt out for to recover from burnout, if not sort of double, right? So if you've been burning out for a year, it's at least a year or two to sort of get over that. And so the longer you stay in it, the worse it is, if that's what you're really feeling.
So the next question is about your post from 2022. That's the leadership dip, I think it's called.
Yeah.
And you're describing the transition from being an individual contributor to taking on a leadership role as a major and sometimes disorienting shift. Mm. What are the most common challenges people face during this transition? And how do you advise them to navigate and overcome these challenges?
Yeah, it's the reason why. Well, I am actually sort of planning. Well, I've sort of got the bones of a book about this actually, but we've just finished the edits of the second edition of the service design book, and so that snuck in the queue, and I can't write two books at once. I struggle enough to write one. And the reason why I wanted to write a book about it, and the reason why I put those sort of coaching reflections out there and stuff like that, is because I don't think this is spoken about enough at all. I really wish someone had said this to me beforehand, and now that I've done lots of coaching with other people, I see that it's a surprise to them too. there's a thing that happens, and part of it is there's no preparation for this. That you know, from kindergarten onwards, you sort of go on a ladder towards where you think you're supposed to be. And it generally means, you know, getting more and more senior in terms of education and then the work you do and so forth. And then you get to the point which you always thought you wanted to be at, which is some kind of leadership role. And suddenly find that you're not prepared for it, don't really know what you're doing necessarily. The biggest shock is probably that, you know, there's this idea that the disappointment about growing up is realizing adults don't have all the answers. The biggest shock, I think, in leadership sometimes is encountering other leaders who they're just making it up as they go along, or they're sometimes just incredibly incompetent. And so that's a bit of a shocker, because it's now your job to make stuff up as you go along. And it feels like there's some secret formula that you should be told, and there isn't. And so that could be a bit of a crisis, because what's happened there is you've sort of got to the top of the place, the top of the kind of tree, because of your craft skills. And all of a sudden, there's a whole bunch of other skills that you need. It's not just because of your craft skills. You probably have been promoted into that because you also have some good people and relationship skills. But it sort of becomes 90% of the work, if not 100% of the work, is all the people and relationship stuff, the leadership and the management things. None of, you know, most of which you'll never have been taught. If you're lucky, you had some good role models. If everyone else is unlucky, you had some terrible role models, and you become sort of, you just repeat that pattern and you become an awful good boss. And what generally has happened is that comes mid-career and sort of mid-life. So the bulk of my coachees are late 30s to late 40s. The youngest was like 24, and I think the oldest was 59. But in general, there's this moment midlife where you're suddenly faced with, well, I've got to where I wanted to go to get to. And now, is this it? Do I really like this? I'm not sure that I want to be doing this. If I don't do this, then what am I? And now that I've given up my craft skills, what am I? So you unravel this one identity, and you haven't yet sort of created the new one. And it really is an existential crisis. And it can last for quite a few years too. So that's what I call the dip.
So let's look at a design leader who decides to step away from the job. So a design leader decides to step away from the job, loses influence and recognition in the process. What do you advise designers to find fulfillment and impact in their career when they step away from a leadership role?
Do you mean they're already in a leadership role and they step away from that? It depends. I mean, they might step back, as we talked about, you know, and go back to being a kind of senior ICM in some way. And often people find real fulfillment in you know, shaping the quality of a particular discipline or craft or practice in the organization, you know, and mentoring others. It depends on, you know, if they, and we talked about they lose their influence. You don't necessarily, right? I think influence is far less a function of the particular role or title. There's a caveat to this I'll come to. Than it is kind of who you are as a person. And we all have encountered people who sometimes are quite junior, who in a meeting or on a call just have some real wisdom to offer. And it's often they're the ones who talk less and sort of listen and then say something and say, well, you know, what about this? Or maybe I think it's around that. And everyone sort of turns and goes, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, you're actually absolutely right. That doesn't necessarily come with seniority or in terms of title. And, you know, we've absolutely all encountered someone who's got a senior title who just blathers on and it's nonsense, right? So, you know, and people are laughing behind their back. So, you know, influence is you can have without that. But if you're feeling like you're kind of there's some kind of loss in terms of, I'd say kind of power. It was probably what I'm really looking at, like actual like power that has been granted to you by virtue of your title. Well, maybe you don't want to be stepping back from that. But I equally have seen people who have gone, you know, all that stakeholder stuff, or you know the fact that all my peers are not from design. It can be really, one of the unsaid things is it can be quite lonely at the top, because all your peers are not design people. They come from different backgrounds, business backgrounds. and you're no longer part of the design gang. And so, because you're their boss, and it can be pretty lonely. And I think that is one of the things where people kind of refine themselves, or they connect with other people. So if you step back from that, sometimes it can be quite positive, because you actually get to be in a kind of community of practice again.
I want to talk with you a little bit about being a leader without the title.
Yeah.
So most organizations where design plays a role are stakeholder driven. And it means that designers, regardless of their official title, often have to take responsibility for their work and advocate for their ideas. And this requires in many cases a form of leadership. What advice do you have for designers who find themselves in a stakeholder driven environment where they have to show leadership without the formal title or authority?
Yeah, just to do it, actually. So I know this sounds glib, because some people are like, well, I'm trying to do it and no one listens to me, or I don't. This is true, and I recognize that truth. That was the caveat I was going to talk about before. There is a thing that happens which, by virtue of whatever title or level you're at or something, you quite literally get invited or not to certain conversations, by which I mean you're on a kind of meeting list for an invite or not. And meetings are where conversations and decisions happen, and that's all they are. And sometimes if you don't have director or manager or something in your title, you're literally not on that email list, right? And so you don't get involved in those conversations. So that's kind of really frustrating. That said, you can often find an ally or someone who is in those conversations and to connect to, and that person becomes a kind of critical stakeholder for you. One of the things is then to look for those people and think, not how can they serve me and how can they make design, praise design and allow design to do stuff that I want them to do, but rather look at those people and go, how can I be a useful partner to them? What problems do these people have? And how can I take some of that off of their plate? Right? And then actually all you're doing is turning the lens of, the sort of user centricity upwards. And then, you make yourself useful to someone, and then you start to have some influence, because, you've done someone a favor, and it's really all about kind of creating those relationships. And that's why that adversarial thing doesn't really work, because that tanks relationships. I think then you can have quite a lot of influence, or you can take some leadership by actually just doing stuff. So, taking initiatives, just creating some of the things you want to see. It's, as always, easier to ask for forgiveness than permission, right? So often you do some stuff, and I think the mistake that people have in their head is, I am going to wait until I'm being made, crowned a leader in some, promotion before I evidence any kind of leadership. And that's not the way it works. If you've ever been part of promotion discussions and the other way around, you're looking for people who are already doing it. And you're looking for people who you can trust. And, by which I mean, if I was ill that day or something, I could send that person in my stead to speak to the senior people, clients or whoever. And I know they wouldn't embarrass me. I know that they will take initiative. I can sort of set and forget. So here's a thing here, and they go, yeah, okay, right, I'll go off, and then they do it. All of those things are evidence of leadership, and you can do those things without having to have the actual position. People, I think, are generally much more timid than they need to be in terms of just starting to do things that they would like to see done.
And how do you see the role of the craftsperson evolving in the coming years?
In some respects, design's craft, if you think about the sort of materiality of the craft, it's changed an awful lot. I emerged into the sort of professional world at the beginnings of the digital interactive kind of revolution, basically. So, a very early 90s. And back then, the sort of pyramid of experience was inverted, right? So there was normally, there had been this hierarchy where someone at the top who was a creative director or something like that, then there was an art director and all of those things, and then there were junior people who learned this stuff. And because the medium hadn't really changed that much, I'm particularly thinking of like advertising stuff as well. And then there was this new medium, this idea that you could interact with the content. I know it sounds kind of ridiculous now, but interact with the content. Even create your own content and put it out there. It was incredibly new. And the sort of old ad guys just didn't get it at all. didn't understand this new medium, and but when we were kind of exploring it and understanding what does it mean to make interactive stuff. And so there was a period where that pyramid was upside down. I think it's sort of, in some respects gone back the other way up in the usual sort of hierarchy of a pyramid. But of course, you also have now all the kind of artificial intelligence stuff going on. I think digital has actually been in a really boring state for the last 10 years. I don't think there's been any, all websites look the same, all apps look the same. I haven't really seen anything that's that interesting. And I don't find AI that interesting either. Because a lot of stuff it does is kind of impressive on the one hand, but also a little bit like, yeah, okay. So, it can do these things and it's sort of impressive technically. They can do these things, but there's not much I've seen that is hugely impressive other than a kind of time-saving kind of thing or a sort of productivity thing. And I don't think productivity is the purpose of life. So I think one of the things that has remained constant, though, even though the tools have changed, and I remember people calling themselves flash designers and things like that. And I remember saying, hey, don't call yourself a flash designer. You're pinning your entire career on someone else's software. So if you think, you're fantastic in Figma, in 10 years' time, Figma won't exist. Maybe, probably. I mean, look at what happened to Adobe. And so what remains is, I think, and even in the face of AI, so discernment and taste. I think there is and experience. I mean, AI can do some of this because it can look back over the sort of a whole load of previous patterns. But that's part of the reason why AI sort of interfaces look like everything else, because that's what it's trained on, right? I think there's sort of discernment and taste, and then there's that little bit of eccentricity that I think can come. Like, I don't count myself amongst these people, but some designers just have this really kind of offbeat take on things, and I think that is really important. Whatever craft, if you talk about it just comes to whatever the tools are there. If you need to make those ideas tangible in some way, and that's what the craft is. So I think it's around sort of converting that sort of discernment and taste into some tangible artifacts in some way. And however you go about doing that, if you can prompt an AI system to do it, go ahead. But I don't know. I'm not kind of that convinced by that.
Andy Polaine, thank you so much for this conversation. Before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you to share some books that you are reading.
I'm not reading these at the moment, actually. I've read several of them I've read, right? So, in fact, all of them I've read. I still think Org Design for Design Orgs by Peter Meerholz. And in fact, read his blog posts and stuff, because he's often updated sort of his thinking about this, is really good. Just for the kind of nuts and bolts, kind of practical things of it. Even though the sort of landscape has shifted a bit since he talked about it, I think it's very useful if you're thinking about, if you're in charge of kind of building out a team and stuff. It's kind of useful still. I just wrote the foreword to Emma Carter's book called Shaping a Designed Up Organization. And it's just come out, actually. It's a really good book. And also she wrote another book called Designed Up, which is about kind of leadership. That I can recommend. Marcia Arico's Design Leadership Chronicles is great. It's done in sort of graphic novel form. And they're sort of little case studies of those design leaders going into organizations and facing all the kind of classic challenges and how they kind of dealt with them. And so that's really great. And it's nice to read it like that. And then there's a guy called James Hollis. He's a Jungian psychoanalyst. And he's written an awful lot around the middle of life and the kind of what he calls the middle passage, or I think Jung calls that. So very quickly, Jung, who was the sort of counterpoint to Freud, and Jung had this idea of the first and second half of life, that you spend the first half of life so building up everything, skills, family, money, career, and all those things, and the second half of life sort of jettisoning it all again, and that he called the first half of life a necessary mistake. And then there's this middle passage, which is that transition through it, which is kind of where I'm coaching people, which is really gnarly. One of James Hollis's books is called Swamplands of the Soul. But it's any of his stuff. And I did a podcast with him, actually. I had him on my podcast. He's a very, very wise old man. Written a lot about kind of going through that midlife moment, middle passage. And so I can recommend almost everything that he's written.
Andy, thank you so much. And for our listeners, if you have any questions or feedback, please leave a message.